Hello and welcome to the forum. I'm John Matisonn. In northern Mozambique, a war has erupted that has been simmering for a long time. There are reports of brutal atrocities. 2,500 people have been killed, 700,000 refugees already in the area. It could be the most serious challenge for South Africa since democracy. How did it happen and why was it allowed to get this bad? To help us understand it, we're fortunate to have with us Joe Hanlon, a long-time Mozambique expert, editor of the newsletter Mozambique News Reports and Clippings, and a senior fellow at the London School of Economics. Joe, welcome.
I'm pleased to be here.
Joe, the Mozambique government saw big opportunities in the vast new gas fields, but they took a dangerous risk.
Well, in 2010, when the gas field was discovered, it turned out to be the second largest gas field in Africa.
Right.
And this was going to have huge benefits for Mozambique. It was all going to be turned into liquefied natural gas, which would require huge investment, but then mostly sold to Asia.
Right.
Now, the first thing that happened was that Credit Suisse and an Abu Dhabi company called Privinvest came to the Mozambicans with this amazing proposal that Mozambique should borrow $2 billion, of which several hundred million would be bribes to the Mozambicans. Remember, this is a proposal from Credit Suisse, one of the biggest banks in the world, and that Mozambique would get a coastal protection service to protect the new gas industry. And so Armando Guebuza, the Mozambican president, and various other Mozambican leaders said, well, this is amazing. This is one of the biggest banks in the world proposing that we should take huge bribes and that this money would all be paid out of the gas. And so that was the $2 billion secret debt. Now, it's interesting that this offer was made to Nigeria and rejected, and made to Angola and rejected, but the Mozambicans didn't look at the fine print and said, sure, let's go with it. What happened then was that Mozambique already had this money and the gas began to get delayed. And one of the conditions that Credit Suisse imposed was that the IMF not be told and that the donors not be told, that this whole loan be kept secret, which violates all the international rules. But Credit Suisse is one of the biggest banks in the world, so we say fine. When it became public, it caused a huge crisis. The IMF was offended, the donors were offended, a lot of aid was cut off to Mozambique because Mozambique was lying to them because the story had leaked out. And of course, the gas was delayed, and Mozambique thought it was going to be getting gas money by 2015 or 2016. Well, we're already in 2021 and Mozambique isn't getting any money from the gas. So it caused a major crisis.
So the potential was enormous. They were going to be able to supply all the way to Johannesburg, all the way to India, competitive rates. The amount of money they were hoping to get was $95 billion over 25 years. That averaged, I worked it out, about 60 billion rand a year. But the world changed and turned away from gas.
Yeah, I mean, two things happened. I mean, it's very hard to predict what the global gas market is going to be. And it does look like that was exaggerated anyway. But the second thing is that when we started out, the environmental importance of gas was that it's a transition fuel. It basically produces half the carbon of coal.
Right.
So in China, for instance, this would be a substitution for coal in coal-fired power stations.
Right.
But what has happened in the last couple of years is the stress has gone that it's still a fossil fuel. And so the pressure has gone on to the energy companies to stop selling gas and oil. And that has led to severe changes in the plans. So ExxonMobil, for instance, which is one of the gas companies working on the Cabo Delgado gas field or planning to work on the Cabo Delgado gas field, has written off $20 billion of its own gas assets, particularly in the US, and has slowed down its development. So it still has Mozambique on the list, but Mozambique is really quite far down the list. So ExxonMobil has already said it's probably not going to go ahead. Eni, the Italian company, which has another piece of this, is doing a floating platform, small floating platform, but has basically not said anything about expansion. So the only company that is left is Total, French company. They were looking originally for a huge program on the Afungi Peninsula in Cabo Delgado. They've now already scaled this down to something that's about a fifth the size. And that was the one that they were just starting to build when the war got to the gates of their project in Cabo Delgado.
And meanwhile, just before we go off this question of the loan, the Mozambique government has presumably spent the $2 billion?
Well, we don't actually know where the $2 billion has gone. We can account for some of it as bribes. What was most bizarre about the loan is that not one penny of it went to Mozambique. All of the money went to this company, Privinvest, all of it. And they had to dole out the bribes and they had to supply equipment. So Kroll, which is the major forensic auditor in the world, looked at this and they said that Privinvest was overpricing, sometimes at triple or four times the value of it. And it also seems clear that Privinvest was supplying equipment which couldn't be used in Mozambique. It supplied fishing boats that didn't satisfy European Union regulations, and it supplied trimaran patrol boats, which are very hard to use in the Mozambique Channel. So Mozambique did get some equipment which they weren't able to use. The fishing boats are still sitting rusting in Mozambique Harbor, in Maputo Harbor. But because all of the money, every penny, went to Privinvest and it had to dole out that money, we don't actually know what happened to it at all.
But it looks like it's not going to come back to Mozambique.
Well, some of it has as bribes. We know that property has been bought. We know some of the use of the money, but very little of it will come back to Mozambique.
And those patrol boats and so on that are useless, that presumably is the government should be responsible. It should have seen the problem and addressed it, but it didn't.
Yes, the government should have seen the problem, but if you guys, for an African government with one of the biggest banks in the world saying this is a wonderful deal, of course you should do it, with the proposals that were being put forward, the business plan, there's a fishing component to this. And if you did a very quick due diligence, you would realize that the business plan was totally exaggerated. And the business plans for the coastal protection was totally exaggerated. But no one checked the numbers, and because they were coming from the biggest bank in the world.
And this this issue is being litigated in the courts in Britain. Am I right?
Yes, it is.
With
And in the courts, I mean, there have already been convictions in the courts in the United States about bribery in this case as well.
And the people convicted are where are they nationals of what country?
At the time, they were British nationals,
Wow.
because Privinvest in Britain was the one that, not Privinvest in Britain, Credit Suisse in Britain was the one that made the deal. But global litigation is really bizarre, so it ended up being litigated in the United States. But the other thing is, still sitting in jail in South Africa is Manuel Chang, who was the finance minister in Mozambique, who partly negotiated this. And he's in jail in South Africa because Mozambique and the United States for the past 2 years have been fighting over which would have the right to extradite him. So he now sits in jail.
Right. And so, but you can't totally exonerate the Mozambican government for not being more diligent and also being open to some form of corruption.
Of course not. And they should have looked much more closely at these contracts. I mean, the fishing contract was just so obvious. You simply needed to go onto the web, onto the FAO website for fish prices to realize that the contract, the proposal was saying they would get 3 times as much for their tuna as Seychelles was getting for the same tuna. They could have checked to see whether the boats that were being proposed were sensible. So of course the Mozambicans were just, their eyes were just glazed over by this promise of hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes that would be paid off by the gas money.
And meanwhile, we'll come to this in the next segment, but none of the money was reaching people in the area where an insurrection of some kind was brewing with dissatisfied local people with local grievances.
No, and what we've seen over the past 20 years, but particularly over the past decade, is that there has been really no development in Mozambique. The leadership has said, okay.
Joe, can I stop you there if you don't mind? We need to take a break. We'll be right back to talk about what it's like in Cabo Delgado on the border of Tanzania, where the people are most affected. We'll be right back. And we're back talking to Joe Hanlon about Cabo Delgado on the northern border of Mozambique and Tanzania. Joe, the problems in the Cabo Delgado area started a long time ago. And it started with local grievances, didn't it?
Yes, it did. I mean, Mozambique has had no serious development over the past 2 decades. It was argued by the IMF and the World Bank that the private sector would end poverty, that greed is good and that the rich should get rich. And that part of it has been happening, but the private sector has not been ending poverty. And so across Mozambique, inequality has been increasing, poverty has been increasing. But it has particularly affected Cabo Delgado, which is one of the poorest and most marginalized provinces. Now, what has happened in the last 15 years, it was suddenly discovered that Cabo Delgado is one of the richest provinces in natural resources. Right. Graphite, and then rubies, and after that, the gas. And what happened particularly with the rubies was that they were controlled by a member of the Frelimo political commission, Frelimo's ruling commission, and that he made a deal with a foreign company, Gem Fields, pushed off thousands of people off the land, artisanal miners, farmers, others. He's now making millions of dollars a year off the rubies. but local people are worse off than they were before. Artisanal miners, traders, local business people all lost out. And that has been repeated across Cabo Delgado, the graphite, other things. And so local people feel increasingly marginalized. Then with the gas development, again, local people were told, oh, you're going to get all these jobs from the gas. And then they began to see these big 4x4s arriving with people from Maputo, with foreigners, to do the exploration, to do the initial development. There was huge developments of hotels and other buildings owned by the elite, but nobody was benefiting. And what you began to see was that local people said, you know, we're not getting anything, we're getting poor, we have no future. And young people with no future in that coastal area really became active. Now, that coastal area is Muslim, and you had Islamic fundamentalists, Mozambican Islamic fundamentalists. I mean, Cabo Delgado has been a playground for missionaries, Christian missionaries, various Islamic missionaries for 2 decades. And so you had a group of fundamentalist Mozambican preachers who'd been largely trained in Tanzania, who put forward a socialist message, which was that Sharia law would bring equity. If there was Sharia law, then the resource wealth would be shared among everybody. And this had some resonance, particularly around the town of Masimba de Praia in the far north.
Right.
And what they began to set up separate mosques, and they were challenged by the police, by the Islamic establishment, by the government. And there were some actual real fights, arrests, so on. And so that led in 2017 to them saying, okay, we have to challenge, the government is challenging us militarily, we have to challenge them. And so they trained some of these young kids mostly as fighters. And in 2017, they attacked Masimba de Praia, occupied Masimba de Praia for a couple of days, basically to show their power, that we can stand up to you. And the government said, okay, this is no longer a religious issue, it's no longer development, this is military. And what happened is interesting, because this one occupation of Masimba de Praia had resonance across this Islamic area among young people.
Right.
And so these people suddenly started getting recruits. Now, they're known, the local name for them has always been Al-Shabaab. And Al-Shabaab just means the youth, the kids.
Oh.
And it has nothing to do with any other Al-Shabaab. It's local language. It just means this is our kids.
Right.
And so Al-Shabaab began to grow over a period of time and started attacking first villages, then roads, then towns, and getting support, getting local support. Now, sometime around 2019, probably, they got into contact with Islamic State. And we don't know how this happened, but this is a war which has been going on for 2 years entirely locally.
Right.
And Islamic State obviously wanted to take claim for what was going on in Mozambique, and I think the insurgents thought they could get support for Islamic State.
Right.
So there was quite a lot of publicity. They did filming and were sending out videos to Islamic State, which was claiming some of their victories. Now, we don't know how much support these guys were getting, but we do know that there are increasing numbers of the commanders are now Tanzanian, and some from further away, as Somalia, for instance. Now, what that continued, and the escalation continued, and they became really quite powerful. And the largest town, the only place that's officially a municipality is Macimba de Praia. And that has a port, was the main port for that northern part of Cabo Delgado. And that was occupied by the insurgents a year ago and is still occupied by the insurgents. They still hold that area. And they hold control now over parts of 6 districts, including all of the road links to the northeast. Now, we have watched this escalation take place. We know that there's partly foreign leadership. We know that some of these leaders claim to be Islamic State. Some quite explicitly say they're not Islamic State. So we're not quite sure what the Islamic State influence is. But what then happened is in the middle of last year, it appears that contact between al-Shabaab and Islamic State was broken. And Islamic State stopped claiming the al-Shabaab victories and said nothing. The Islamic State news agency didn't report anything until this big attack on Palma. Now, what we know about the contact with the insurgents in Palma, and the video footage that they used came from Macimba de Praia a year ago when they were still in contact with al-Shabaab. So we don't know quite what their influence is now.
So the connection between local al-Shabaab and IS, Islamic State, was broken, but then it resumed again.
Well, we're not sure it did. I mean, we know the claim from for Palma is fake news, that they produced it without having contact.
Right.
We also know that some of the commanders from Tanzania say that they are IS. So basically the connection seemed to be there, but tenuous at best at the moment.
But do we know where the money comes from and where the weapons come from?
Well, the weapons come almost entirely from raids on government arsenals. I mean, the first thing that the al-Shabaab does when they are in, when they raid a town, is they go to the police station, the army barracks, take all the weapons, and they've stolen or captured huge amounts of stuff, armored cars, many police cars, so on, this kind of thing.
So the Mozambican authorities are unable to protect
these heavy weapons.
And the Mozambican police and military are unable to protect their own equipment?
No, they just, I mean, the police and army, Mozambique is a very corrupted country. Yeah. And the police and army are corrupted too, and they are not going to risk their lives for very low pay. Right. They've been making up their pay through corruption. So when al-Shabaab comes in, they leave.
And so, sorry, go on.
So the weapons are coming almost entirely from government stocks, even uniforms. So the insurgents wear government uniforms, which creates, of course, a lot of confusion. But money, I mean, in the raid in Palma, they very carefully broke into every bank. And the local TV says they stole $1 million.
Good God.
So they are partly funding themselves. They always break into banks wherever they go.
So they're not especially funded from IS internationally or anything like that?
Well, we think there's some money coming in internationally, but we're not sure it's IS. I mean, part of the question is this Islamic State, or are these other supporters in the Arab states in the Middle East who are supporting this? And I mean, there are major theological differences between the al-Shabaab leadership and IS. Right. The al-Shabaab are Quranists, which means they only believe in the Quran. They don't believe in the other sacred books. And so that leads to very interesting differences. They only pray 3 times a day. and they pray with shoes on rather than with taking their shoes off.
Right.
And they're seen as fundamental because that was the way it was done in the Quran, and the 5 times a day, and taking your shoes off comes in the other books later. And so the kinds of divisions with some of the more theological writers who are looking at this say that the divisions between al-Shabaab and the IS theologically are actually quite important in this.
We need to take a break. We'll be right back with Joe Hanlon. And we're back talking to Joe Hanlon about Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. Joe, so do we know if militants are coming from the Middle East or Europe to Cabo Delgado?
Definitely not from Europe, possibly from the Middle East. There are stories which have come out of people who are described as white or Arab who do not speak local languages.
Right.
But most of the leadership seems to be Swahili speaking. And Swahili, the local language along the coast is Mwani, which is Swahili related. And so that seems to be where most of it is coming from. We're not sure about further abroad, but definitely not Europe. We do think that there has been some freelance jihadis have made their way there, have probably been involved in training as the insurgents have developed their skills over time.
So this obviously attracts the interest of world powers. Now, the first one I was aware of in the area were the Russians.
Mozambique decided they had a military problem, that the army was not going to be reformed, that they would bring in mercenaries. And so President Nyusi talked to the Russians, and a Russian mercenary company called Wagner, private company, but with government links, as old mercenaries have, sent people who had been in Libya and sent them to northern Mozambique. Libya is desert. Cabo Delgado is dense forest.
Right.
They did not cope with Cabo Delgado, lost a number of people, and finally abandoned ship in early last year.
Right.
Now, the next people they turned to with Dyke Advisory Group,
right,
and who have, date all the way back to Rhodesia and apartheid and so on. I mean, you look at the pictures of some of their pilots, they're white-haired like me. And they've been doing anti-poaching in Mozambique, so had contacts already. And they said, okay, why don't you get us in? Now, unlike Wagner, they weren't going to have people on the ground, and they didn't. They've been doing air cover with light planes, with helicopters. And they have the same difficulty as other people of saying, you're flying over a community and you can't tell who's insurgents and who's not.
Right.
So some of their work was effective, but they also eventually started using Syria-style barrel bombs, packing explosives into the kind of propane tanks that you use for cooking gas, and just throwing those overboard. And so Amnesty International accused them of war crimes for bombing civilians with these Syria-style barrel bombs. Amnesty is interesting because they accuse everybody of war crimes, that the insurgents are really quite brutal and are committing war crimes, but so is the government.
I've seen some of the pictures. I mean, there's a really very extraordinary brutality.
Civil wars always are brutal because you're killing your neighbor. It's internal, and I wrote an Open University course on civil wars. I was previously at the Open University in England, and wrote the textbook Civil War, Civil Peace. And one of the things that comes out of that is that civil wars just are really nasty.
Yeah.
And you are, and so the beheading, of course, by the insurgents, they're not all that well armed. And so for the poor peasants who have been part of this, peasants have only two farm tools. One is a hoe and the other is a machete. And so peasants become really good at using a machete. So that if you are going to battle and your only weapon is your machete, then the only way you can be sure to kill somebody is to cut their head off.
Right.
And so beheading is as much an effect of it. I mean, it has no particular cultural links. It's because you're using a machete as your weapon and you want to kill people.
Right.
Of course, it does scare people. And the thing about any insurgent group is it's terrorist. It wants to create terror.
Yeah.
And the government is responding with state terrorism because it wants to make people frightened. Everybody wants to make the ordinary people frightened.
So the government was brought in the Russians, and did the government also bring in this white Southern African Dyke group?
Yes, these were both brought in by the Ministry of Interior, because one of your problems in Mozambique also is there is an ongoing battle between the Ministry of Interior and the police on one side, and the Ministry of Defense and the Army and Air Force on the other side. And the police have a paramilitary riot police, which are actually better trained and more disciplined than the army. So they were taking over the fighting in Cabo Delgado, and they hired the Russians, and they hired the Dyke Advisory Group, South African group. And so one of the reasons the war has been hard for the government to fight is because Interior and Defense are much too busy fighting each other and taking bribes and so on to bother fighting a war.
Which means one way and the other, they don't have the capacity to do this themselves.
They don't have the capacity and the discipline and the will to do it. They're just not, they're not up to, I mean, one of the things that is clear about the insurgents is that they are disciplined and they're motivated. And these young people are saying, this is the only way that we are going to have a future, that we are going to get a share of the wealth, is to fight the government and win against the government.
What about, so of course now you've got both American and British supposed trainers, military trainers in the area?
I mean, that leads to a broader question, because first of all, should you be doing military help at all? Does this have a military solution?
Exactly.
And then the second thing is that if you do believe it has a military solution, are you going to send in foreign soldiers to fight local insurgents? No. The only way you'll send in foreign troops is if you're fighting ISIS. Now, at a press conference a month ago, in which the Americans designated al-Shabaab as the local ISIS and a foreign terrorist organization, they made clear they want to use their enemy now, the global enemy is ISIS, and they want Mozambique to be a base in the fight against ISIS. And that's why they want soldiers there. Now, for others, for Britain, for Portugal, sending troops is also about fighting ISIS. This is the only way you can justify it at home. If you're going to send troops to help fight against local kids who want to share the resources, that's not going to fly at home. Now, for the South Africans, this becomes complicated because it has to be ISIS, because the South Africans are putting forward a line that this is going to spread to Cape Town, and that ISIS will recruit people, and that there do seem to be some fighters in Cabo Delgado who've come from South Africa. What's interesting is that the fighters in Cabo Delgado have come from other parts of Mozambique, not just Cabo Delgado, and some seem to have come from South Africa and from Tanzania. for their own reasons. Now, South Africa wants to send troops. The army is desperate to get people on boots on the ground. And that there is, so they say, well, if we don't stop this militarily, then they will have this, they will be fighting in Cape Town. Now, there's also for Portugal and for South Africa a deep psychological reason to want to get troops in, because both were defeated in Mozambique.
Right.
The South African army was defending Renamo, and this was in the era of apartheid,
Right.
and lost that war. The Portuguese were the colonial power and lost that war.
Right.
And so both of them want to get troops back in to prove that they really, Mozambique needs them now, even though they lost the war before. So there's important psychological reasons. And for the US, it wants bases in Mozambique. For the European Union, it feels it wants to intervene militarily. But the question is a broader one. I mean, does this have a military solution? And remember that what this war is really about is jobs. And that if you had started out 5 years ago to create jobs, the war never would have started.
Right.
And you look at Total says that it's going to create 15,000 jobs on the Afungi Peninsula, of which only 2,000 will be Mozambicans, and most of those will come from the south of Mozambique because they need to be better educated. So there's no local jobs from the gas. Now, if we had started to say, let's create jobs, this would look differently.
And local jobs. Local jobs.
Local jobs.
Exactly.
And look at the cost of the war. The Mozambican government estimates that it will cost $100 million to rebuild Palma. The World Food Program wants $80 million just to feed the people who are displaced. If that $180 million was used to create jobs, the war would stop. And there's some recent research which has just been published this week, which shows that, which is interviews with women who were held captive by the insurgents, by al-Shabaab.
Yes.
And one of the things that they, of course, talk to the local recruits in local language and so on. And they realized that many of the local recruits are only there because they thought they could get jobs. They thought this would bring change, and they'd like to leave.
Right.
So even now, if jobs were provided, then the insurgents wouldn't be able to recruit, and many of the young local members of the insurgents would leave if they could get something else. And you know, if we took that $200 million and created 10,000 jobs in every village, well, it doesn't matter what kind of jobs planting trees would do, but they should have some kind of training. And the point is that you want people to learn to be carpenters. You want to upgrade the agriculture level. So this means mechanization. This means irrigation. This means agricultural extension. It means a kind of support for agriculture and for job creation, which the Mozambican government has never done, because the IMF and the World Bank has always said the private sector will do it. So it requires an ideological change by the international community that says, okay, yes, we are prepared to put in money to create jobs, and yes, we accept that it isn't going to come from the private sector.
Joe, we need to break. We're going into our final segment in a moment. We'll be back with Joe Hanlon. And we're back talking to Joe Hanlon about the difficult problem in northern Mozambique. Joe, so I mean, there's been a case of neglect by the Mozambique authorities, but also the whole region. South Africa doesn't seem to have taken this as high a priority as it should have either.
Well, it goes back really 20 years to the end of the Cold War. And the line at the time was that the private sector will solve all of our poverty problems, and that people should get rich, and that the wealth would trickle down to the poor people. And of course, none of that has happened. And that's not how you create jobs in Europe or in the United States. Now, for Mozambique in particular, this is still a rural country. So most of your jobs are going to be in agriculture.
Right.
But it's not agriculture with a hoe and a machete. It's agriculture with some mechanization. It's agriculture with irrigation. I mean, Mozambique doesn't even use fertilizer in its agriculture because fertilizer is too expensive. So you have subsidized fertilizer. You bring in packages to support people. And we've seen that happen in a few places in Mozambique. We wrote a book called Chickens and Beer. And the reason for the chickens was it was about the development of soybeans as chicken feed in Garui in Zambezia province. Now, the reason to bring that up is that what happened there was that young people made such a profit growing soybeans that they were the ones who had motorcycles. And they were the ones who were going into the discos at the weekend on their motorcycles. And suddenly they were the role models. And this was out of farming. And the transformation for young people away from hoe farming to some sort of serious commercial farming made them important people. Now, you could do that in Cabo Delgado, but it requires investment, it requires support, it requires people to know that they have a future. You can create other jobs, all sorts of other jobs in Cabo Delgado, which might be linked to the resources. And you can create jobs, train people to be builders, train people to be carpenters and electricians and so on. None of that training seems to be available. And ensure that they have jobs so that when you leave your training, you have somewhere to go and work.
Right.
That requires huge government intervention, which up till now, the international community has said, no, governments don't do that. But governments do that. That's how, this is how.
Well, of course, in America, there's starting to be, to some degree, a rethinking of that. But I want to focus in our last few minutes on Mozambique politics, because obviously that's where the government is. Renamo, the old apartheid and Rhodesia created opposition group, are they still a factor, or is that no longer a big problem?
No, Renamo is really no longer an issue. They have finally accepted a demobilization deal with the government in which they are basically just an opposition party and a weak opposition party. There is a tiny group, the Renamo junta, which is still fighting, but I mean, they're not enough of them to be important.
Okay, well, that's one bit of good news, but now we get to the Frelimo, the governing party, and the president, Filipe Nyusi. Obviously, they are not doing the job.
Well, Frelimo has been in power since independence. They were the independence movement, the only independence movement. And they have kept power by setting up a corruption and patronage system, which is absolutely total.
Yeah.
Because of the gas money, it has been accepted by the international community. So I worked with journalists on the 2019 election, which was totally fraudulent. And we published it. The European Union did a hugely critical report. But the European Union continues to support Frelimo because they want to invest in the gas.
Right.
And when I talk to ambassadors, they say, well, our first priority is to get our companies into the gas investments. Now, what we have to say now is that what Palma shows is that when you get your companies into the gas investments, they're likely to get killed. And that you have to change your strategy if you want investment in Mozambique. And changing your strategy means to create jobs first, to do training first, to get huge numbers of jobs, not token corporate social investment. We're talking about creating tens or hundreds of thousands of jobs across the country. And that this is a stimulus for the economy. It's a stimulus for foreign investment, but it also will end the discontent. And so the donors and the ambassadors have to look at this and have to say, okay, we've had people killed in Palma. These are people that we encourage to invest. Companies have lost millions of dollars in the police raids. It's very interesting. The insurgents did not attack any of the gas contracting installations. The raids on the gas contractors were all by the police and the army after the insurgents were left. But the police and army have done millions of dollars of damage. So we have to say that the war has to be stopped if we're going to encourage investment. And the war is not going to be stopped militarily. The war is going to be stopped because the insurgents don't want to fight anymore.
But doesn't this also mean, I mean, obviously one can talk about the donors and the donors have different interests from Southern Africans, but it means that both Mozambique and South Africa as the regional power need to be more capable states than they've been up to now.
Oh, yes. I mean, this requires a transformation of the liberation-ruled states. Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa have not had transformations away from the liberation movement, and the liberation movements themselves have not been able to transform. And how that happens, I don't know. But what we have to say is that that's not going to be done in the short term. And if we want to stop the war in Mozambique in the short term, we have to make some kind of deal with the corrupt Frelimo government, with the oligarchs, and say, okay, allow money to be spent to create jobs to stop the war. And that requires, some negotiations, requires some time, requires some support, and requires recognition that Mozambique is a corrupt patronage state, and that anything you do requires patronage for Frelimo.
Joe, in our last 60 seconds, if I'm not mistaken, you've been a long time, certainly supporter of liberation in Mozambique, and also perhaps of Frelimo. Are you disappointed?
Of course I'm disappointed. And I supported the Mozambique in the early days of independence when transformation really was taking place. Then South Africa, as the apartheid state, killed 1 million people in Mozambique. Nobody remembers that. And then the IMF and the World Bank came in to clean up the mess and destroyed the economy. So I've watched Mozambique be attacked again and again, and watched Frelimo finally accept that and say, okay, we're just going to be corrupt as greedy and everybody else. And I'm saddened by that. I'm not quite sure how we get out of that hole.
Joe, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. I could talk further, but this is information that we really need to get out to people. Thank you so much for your time, Joe Hanlon. Thanks for watching. Next time, please come back, watch the forum. I'm John Matisonn.